sweetheart, baby doll.
Hollywood in its golden age came up with some very strange ideas. Three's Company was one of them. A hit sitcom about a man pretending to be gay while living with two young women in a beachside apartment. A show that had audiences completely hooked for years. But honestly, that premise is not even the strangest part. The strangest part is everything surrounding this show. It had to reinvent itself 3 times before it got approved. One actress was once thrown off the set for being too sexy. And then, there are the behind-the-scenes stories that sound made up, but feel exactly like old Hollywood. Tonight, I want to open that door again with you. We are going to walk through the 20 strangest facts about Three's Company. The closer you look at this show, the stranger it gets, compared with the harmless little memory people usually have of it. Number 20. Jack Tripper had to pretend to be gay for Three's Company to get on the air. Looking back now, Three's Company feels like such a light little sitcom. A beachside apartment, a clumsy guy, 2 young women, studio laughter, an opening theme that instantly brings back a whole golden era of American television. But you really have to put it back in 1977 to understand how wild that idea actually was. That was a time when American television was still nervous about things that now sound almost harmless. They used to be afraid to show a toilet on screen. They used to get awkward just mentioning divorced women. And the idea of one single man living with 2 single women was sensitive enough to make the entire concept of this show feel like a little landmine sitting right in the middle of prime time. So Three's Company had to find a way around it. Jack Tripper could not be accepted as just some normal roommate. He was only allowed into that apartment because the landlord believed he was gay. I have always thought that was the strangest thing about this show. One of America's classic sitcoms was standing on top of a lie that everybody had to pretend to accept so the laughter could keep going. And trust me, that awkwardness was not just built into the plot. It was baked into the way this show came into the world in the first place. That brings us to number 19. Number 19. This show had to reinvent itself 3 times before people embraced it. Some sitcoms come into the world like everything was settled from the start. Three's Company did not. It feels more like a house that got taken apart and rebuilt so many times that I sometimes think it is a miracle it stood up as long as it did. Before America ever met Jack, Janet, and Chrissy, this show had to die and come back not once, but at least 3 times. The first version, made in 1976 with Larry Gelbart, stayed too close to the British original and did not sell. Fred Silverman saw something in the idea, but he also understood it could not go into prime time looking like that. So the project got dragged back onto the operating table. Ted Bergman and Don Taffner brought in Don Nickel, Michael Ross, and Bernie West to rewrite it, and everything got adjusted from the farce rhythm to the character profiles. Jack was no longer the same man from the earlier version. Janet and Chrissy got reshaped too, so they would connect better with American audiences. Number 18. Don Knotts once worried he could not keep up with the cast. There is something I really love about old Hollywood. Sometimes the people who seem like they have belonged on screen forever are the very ones who feel the most nervous when they step into a new kind of show. That was Don Knotts when he came into Three's Company. In his memories of that period, Knotts admitted he was genuinely scared because the Andy Griffith Show had been done in a single camera style, while Three's Company was a completely different animal shot with 3 cameras much faster in rhythm, with a live audience sitting right there and a cast that was a lot younger than he was. He remembered that feeling with a line that sounds humble and very much like Don Knotts. They were all younger than he was, and they were all good. A comedy legend walks onto a soundstage and still feels like the one who has to prove himself all over again. But then, the second he appeared in front of the studio audience, the fear almost melted away in an applause break so long, people still talked about it later. And if you think that is already one of the strangest turns in this show's history, Just wait until you hear the even stranger story, where the reason someone lost a role was being too sexy. Number 17. Loni Anderson was turned down for being too glamorous. The minute you hear this story, you understand just how strange old Hollywood could be. Loni Anderson auditioned for Chrissy Snow, and according to what John Ritter later said, she was very good. She was not rejected for being flat weak or lacking charm. She was rejected for standing out too much. Ritter basically said, audiences would have a hard time believing someone like Loni Anderson would need roommates at all. That reason alone is enough to make me laugh, because it tells you everything about one very old kind of American television casting logic. They were not just choosing beautiful people. They were choosing the exact level of beauty audiences would accept inside that particular sitcom world. And that is where I have always felt this decision was both cruel and correct. Chrissy was not supposed to be the kind of woman who walked into a room and instantly took over the air. The role needed a softer kind of innocence, something a little dreamy, a little ditzy, so the audience would believe she belonged in that silly but lovable apartment. Loni Anderson had a completely different kind of presence. She was too sharp, too confident, too much like the kind of woman Hollywood would place in the center of the frame, not splitting rent with two other people. She did later appear on Three's Company, but only as a guest star in the episode Coffee Tea or Jack. Number 16. Suzanne Somers appears twice in the opening. Have you ever noticed something strange in the opening of Three's Company? The music starts, the ocean breeze blows through. Jack Tripper stumbles around on that bicycle like he cannot even ride straight for a few opening seconds. Then a brunette girl passes by. Jack wipes out, and the whole moment goes by so quickly that almost nobody stops to think about it. But that brunette is not some random actress. That is Suzanne Somers too, just with a different hair color. That is the part that makes me laugh every time I think about it. This show hides a sly little trick right in front of the audience, and most of us never noticed it for years. You see Chrissy in one place, you see a brunette in another, and your brain automatically files them as two different women. That was the rhythm of television back then, fast, neat, and clever. They did not need to underline it. They just had to move quickly enough for your eyes to believe what they had just seen. Number 15. They went looking for a fake Don Knotts, then had to bring in the real Don Knotts. Old Hollywood had a habit that was both funny and a little reckless. When a certain type of actor was too unique, they would not even dare dream of hiring that exact person right away. They would go looking for a cheaper version, a close enough version, a safer version. And that is exactly what happened on Three's Company when they needed a new Mr. Furley. Production did not originally aim straight at Don Knotts. They just wanted someone with that same kind of energy, that quality, where the minute he walks into a room, the whole rhythm shifts a little ridiculous, lovable and funny before he even finishes the sentence. But this is the trouble with Hollywood. There are some people whose outside you can imitate the hair, the posture, the squint, but nobody can touch their actual rhythm. Don Knotts was one of those people. The more they looked for a copy, the more they realized what they needed was not somebody like Don Knotts. They needed Don Knotts himself. Number 14. One salary demand blew Three's Company apart. By season 5, Three's Company was no longer some little sitcom. It was a money machine, and Suzanne Somers knew it. She wanted to jump from $30,000 an episode to $150,000 plus 10% ownership in the series, so she could share in the rerun money later on. On the surface, that sounds like standard Hollywood negotiating, but this thing exploded much faster than most people expected. Somers and Joyce DeWitt had a contract clause that required them to be paid the same salary, while John Ritter was protected by a star clause, which meant he always had to be paid the most. That alone was enough to turn the whole negotiation into a minefield. When the request was denied, Somers did not come back to work, saying she had broken ribs and could not perform. Some people in wardrobe did not believe that story. The fallout came almost immediately. Then they chose a way of handling it that still feels cold when you think about it now. They did not fire her right away. They cut Chrissy down to little end tags of about 1-minute shots separately, never letting her stand with the other actors, never letting her come onto the main set, almost turning her into a ghost of the character she had once helped turn into an icon. Once Somers began speaking publicly about how she had been treated, the door slammed shut for good. She was fired, her 3-show deal with CBS collapsed too, and television more or less turned its back on her for years. That was the dark side of Hollywood in those days. They could lift you all the way into the sky, then teach the whole industry how to act like you had never existed. Number 13. Joyce DeWitt had one unusual rule: she would never show bare legs. Now think about this for a second. Three's Company was a late 70s sitcom from a time when American television was starting to love short skirts, short shorts, camera angles, showing off legs, showing off shape, showing off that bright, youthful, sun-drenched energy. And yet, right in the middle of that world, Joyce DeWitt kept a very particular rule for herself. If her legs were going to be on camera, she was wearing pantyhose. No bare legs, no exceptions. Janet could walk into frame, looking polished, charming, and very feminine, but always in a way Joyce DeWitt felt she could control. It is a tiny thing, but I will tell you honestly, old Hollywood often reveals a lot through tiny rules like that. An actress is not just putting on a costume for a role. She is negotiating with the camera, with her public image, with what America at that moment wants to see in a woman on screen. Joyce DeWitt was never loud about it. She just quietly kept her rule so steadily that it became part of her backstage identity. And Hollywood really does have a strange way of rewarding the odd little things. That habit eventually led to an advertising deal with legs. Pretty amazing. Number 12. Don Knotts was one of the few people who did not turn his back on Suzanne Somers. When Suzanne Somers' salary dispute exploded, the atmosphere on the Three's Company set changed completely. Money is already awkward enough in Hollywood, but what really made things turn cold was the way people started avoiding each other. John Ritter and Joyce DeWitt were said to have ignored Suzanne during that stretch, and for a lot of people on the set, she had almost become someone you were not supposed to go near. That is when Don Knotts did something that honestly not everybody in this business is kind enough to do. He did not like the way Suzanne was being isolated, partly because he had already lived through something very similar himself. Years earlier, back on the Andy Griffith Show, Don Knotts had gone through almost the same thing after asking for more money. He knew exactly how quickly a person could become somebody the whole set looked at differently, just for daring to bring up salary. So, at one point right there on the set when he saw John and Joyce ignoring Suzanne, he flat out said he was going over to talk to her. That sounds like a small thing, but in an atmosphere that tense, it carries real weight. Number 11. Priscilla Barnes called this the saddest period of her career. When Priscilla Barnes joined Three's Company, the show was still famous, still had an audience, still carried that bright, familiar glow America had known for years. But there are some shows that look warm from the outside, and then you step inside and realize the atmosphere has changed completely. For Barnes, this was not the joyful opportunity people might assume it was. Later on, she said plainly that her time working on the show was the unhappiest period of her career, to the point that right after being cast, she had moments when she wanted to quit because she could not stand the mood behind the scenes. Sometimes a show is still running, the audience is still laughing, the cameras are still rolling, but the people inside the frame feel like they are going to work inside a place full of tension and control. Barnes even talked about things that sound small, like the way her looks were watched so closely, and even that was enough to show she had not stepped into a relaxed or easy environment at all. Number 10. Jeffrey Tambor showed up 3 times, and the audience still did not notice. There are things that only happened on old television, and if you did not look closely, they slipped right past you, like they were never there. Jeffrey Tambor is a perfect example. In the universe of Three's Company and the Ropers, he did not just drop in once and disappear. He showed up 3 different times, and each time he was playing a completely different person. One time he was Winston Cromwell III, another time he was Dr. Tom Miller, and then he turned up again as Dr. Philip Green. Same face, 3 different men, and most viewers back then never even stopped to ask why. I have always felt this was very true to the rhythm of American television in those days. They worked fast, they worked constantly, they kept the machine moving, and if an actor fit the rhythm, fit the camera, fit the feeling of the set, they were perfectly willing to bring him back in a brand new role without explaining much of anything. Audiences were more generous then, too. They were not staring at every detail like they were building a case file. If that week's story worked and the laughs landed in the right places, that was enough. Number 9. Larry Dallas was only supposed to appear once Richard Kline did not walk into Three's Company as a major player. At first, Larry Dallas was just a guest role meant to show up and then leave like so many supporting characters in sitcoms back then. But the second he started playing opposite John Ritter, everything changed very quickly. Those two had a rhythm together that felt completely natural. The more awkward Jack was, the slicker Larry became, and that contrast gave their scenes an extra spark. That is the kind of thing you cannot always predict on paper. Some roles are written well and then leave no impression at all once the camera rolls. Other roles are treated like a quick pass-through, and then suddenly they stick because the camera catches something alive. Larry was that kind of case. He did not need to take over the center. He just needed to walk in at the right moment, add a little trouble, a little bragging, a little mischief, and suddenly Jack Tripper had somebody who could push the story farther. Number 8. Norman and Helen left Three's Company for a spin-off, and in the end, they could not come back. Norman and Helen Roper left Three's Company to do a show of their own, and at the time, that sounded perfectly reasonable. That couple was popular, audiences already knew them, so ABC believed they could stand on their own with the Ropers. More importantly, there was a pretty comforting promise sitting behind the whole thing. If the new show did not work, they could come back to Three's Company. Sounds good, right? Go try your luck, and if it does not work, you go back to where you were. The problem is, television does not operate as smoothly as promises on paper. The Ropers really did fail to last, but by the time Norman and Helen should have been able to return, Three's Company was no longer standing still and waiting for them. Don Knotts had stepped in as Mr. Furley. Audiences loved him right away. The rhythm of the show changed completely, and that old empty spot was not empty anymore. Number 7. Joyce DeWitt said John Ritter had relationships with several female co-stars. It was not until many years after Three's Company ended that Joyce DeWitt shared something that made quite a few people look back at John Ritter a little differently. In a conversation on a program hosted by Suzanne Somers, DeWitt said Ritter had been involved with several of his female co-stars. Suzanne Somers also said she had no idea about any of that while the show was still being made. What made this detail stand out was not noise or scandal. It was the timing. For years, John Ritter's public image had been that of a charming, clumsy, lovable comedy star who seemed to have almost no edge to him at all. So when a story like that surfaces long after everything is over, it instantly changes the temperature of those old memories. Number 6. The cast gradually passed away, and John Ritter was the first to go too soon. There comes a point when people stop looking back at Three's Company by counting seasons or how many times that apartment door swung open. They start counting the moments when a familiar face left real life. Audra Lindley, who gave Helen Roper that perfect mix of sharpness and charm, was the first member of the cast to pass away in 1997. 14 months later, Norman Fell was gone too. Don Knotts was only 4 months younger than Norman Fell, but he lived more than 7 years longer. And then there was John Ritter, younger than all of them, and yet the one whose life was shortest of all, dying just 6 days before his 55th birthday. Back when people watched the show, all they saw was laughter, perfectly timed falls, and those funny little arguments inside that apartment. But time always does what no series can stop it from doing. It pulls people out from under the lights one by one until the characters who once belonged to America's evenings become part of memory. Number 5. All 3 stars refused to sing the theme song. This is one of those very Hollywood stories I have always found both funny and oddly charming. You hear the Three's Company theme, and that apartment door instantly opens in your mind, along with California Sunshine and Jack Tripper getting ready to do something ridiculous. It is tied to the show so tightly that you might assume the 3 leads must have rushed into a recording booth with all the excitement in the world. But no. Michael Ross and the producers wanted John Ritter, Joyce DeWitt, and Suzanne Somers to sing it themselves, and all 3 of them said no. On screen, they were such a seamless trio that it felt like they could do anything together. Off-screen, they were still 3 very different people, each with their own limits. Just because you are standing at the center of a hit sitcom does not mean you also want to grab a microphone. Some people know exactly where they are supposed to shine, and they also know they do not need to try every single thing Hollywood puts in front of them. Number 4. Everybody thinks Three's Company was an original American idea. When people talk about Three's Company, most of them immediately think of it as a purely American sitcom, from the California Sunshine to John Ritter's comic timing, to that very ABC feeling that defined late 70s television. The show feels so deeply American that people almost forget it did not begin there. The truth is, Three's Company was adapted from the British sitcom Man About the House. In other words, the premise that American audiences later treated like part of their own television history actually came from the other side of the Atlantic. The interesting part is that the American version never really felt borrowed. It became so popular that it practically swallowed the memory of the original. And that is not something every remake can do. Number 3. That famous apartment kept changing addresses. There are things on television that look so familiar. People just assume they always stayed in exactly the same place. The apartment in Three's Company is one of those things. You see that door, that sofa, that atmosphere of total confusion every time Jack Tripper tells a lie and gets caught 2 seconds later, and it all feels so stable. But it was not. Over the course of 3 seasons, that apartment was assigned 3 different addresses, and even funnier than that, none of them were real. This is a tiny detail, but it says a lot about sitcoms in that era. Television was not worried about making every last detail line up like a property record. They just needed the audience to believe in the feeling of the place. And audiences absolutely did. People did not remember the street number. They remembered that apartment as a living stage, where every door opening meant misunderstanding, argument, cover-up, and laughter. Number 2. The Season 1 DVD got rushed out after John Ritter's death. When John Ritter died in 2003, America did not just lose a very special comic actor. It felt like people were suddenly pulled backward into an older era of television, back to the time when Jack Tripper only had to miss one step to make an entire living room laugh. And that was when something very memorable happened. The Season 1 DVD of Three's Company was pushed to market earlier than planned simply because demand rose too quickly after his death. Maybe this is what makes television different from movies. A theatrical film can be loved, praised, and then closed up neatly. A sitcom lives a different kind of life. It settles into people's habits. It sits in the living room. It goes with dinner, with that last laugh at the end of the day, with years of life before you even realize how deeply attached you have become. So, when John Ritter died, the audience's reaction was not just grief. They wanted to hold on to a piece of that feeling. They wanted to go back. And that leads right into the strangest thing in this whole story. Because there is a paradox at the center of Three's Company, and it explains why this show has lasted longer than a whole lot of things that were judged more highly at the time. Number 1. Three's Company was loved by the public and dismissed by the critics. And here we are at the thing that to me says more about Three's Company than any award or review ever could. America laughed with this show. Audiences welcomed it into their living rooms, knew every face, every John Ritter pratfall, every moment when that apartment door opened and you just knew chaos was coming. They loved the show in the very way only Golden Age television could inspire. It became part of routine, part of memory, part of evening life in America. But the critics were not nearly that generous. To a lot of them, Three's Company was just a lightweight sitcom, a little loud, a little too dependent on sexual misunderstanding and bedroom-style confusion to get its laughs. They looked down on it. The audience did not. The audience only knew the show made them happy, and a lot of times in Hollywood history, that has turned out to be a bigger victory than any high-minded praise. Maybe because I have lived long enough with shows like this, I always feel a special softness toward the ones that were looked down on and still managed to live on in the public heart. Three's Company is exactly that kind of show. People can dismiss it, they can treat it like light entertainment, but decades later, people still remember it. And in this business, being remembered is the hardest thing of all. Looking back at all these stories, I feel more than ever that Hollywood back then really was a place that was both charming and so unreasonable you could never invent it. A show could begin with a lie, survive on strange casting decisions, go through cast changes and broken promises, and still end up living in the memory of millions of people. And that is exactly what I want to do on this channel too. Open one door after another in classic American film and television with you, and revisit a golden age that was dazzling, but also full of behind-the-scenes stories that are hard to believe. If you enjoy journeys like that too, subscribe to the channel and stay with me through this series. I will see you in the next video.